It was supposed to be a routine checkup. But when Dr. Daniel Reed looked at me like he was seeing more than just a patient, I realized some lines aren't drawn on paper. They're drawn in the heart. I hadn't expected much from the appointment. A new clinic, a new doctor, just another item to cross off a list I'd been ignoring for too long. At 46, I'd become used to the kind of medical conversations that were brisk, polite, and purely functional. The last few years had left me living in a silence I hadn't chosen, one that had settled over me after losing my partner. The quiet was familiar now, a space I filled with work, errands, and the occasional phone call I could cut short without guilt. But Daniel Reed didn't speak like other doctors. He didn't treat my words as a checklist to be ticked and filed. He listened as if every detail mattered, even the ones I hadn't intended to share. I noticed it within minutes. The way his attention stayed anchored, not darting to a clock or a screen, not interrupted by the rustle of paperwork. His questions weren't mechanical. They felt as if they were reaching past the facts into the spaces between them, searching for something unspoken. At first, I tried to treat it as nothing more than good bedside manner. Plenty of doctors knew how to project warmth. But this wasn't just warmth, it was precision. He seemed to notice shifts in my voice, pauses I didn't mean to take. When I hesitated before answering about my sleep habits, his brow drew the faintest line, as though cataloging not just the response, but the weight behind it. I told myself I was imagining the change in the air, that the extra beat of silence after I answer a question was just my own mind stretching moments into meaning. Yet as the exam went on, I felt my guard, the one I'd built so carefully, begin to loosen. He asked about family history, and I mentioned my partner's passing. His reaction was subtle, almost imperceptible, a fractional softening in his posture, a pause before moving on. It wasn't pity, it was recognition, the kind you can't fake. There was a strange sense of being seen without having to perform for it. No polite platitudes, no rehearsed condolences. He simply adjusted his pace, as though recalibrating the entire conversation around the fact that I wasn't just a body in a chair. I was someone who'd learned how to carry absence without letting it crush me. The questions kept coming, but they weren't just about blood pressure and cholesterol. He wanted to know about my daily routine, how often I stepped outside, whether I found time for anything that felt like joy. They were harmless enough on the surface, but I could feel the quiet pull of them, drawing out fragments of myself I usually left untouched. By the time the appointment neared its end, I couldn't decide if the unease in my chest was medical or something else entirely. I'd answered every question, endured every moment of silence, but there was one thing I didn't voice, that in less than an hour, this man had shifted something in me. It wasn't attraction in the usual sense. It was the sudden awareness that my life, so neatly contained, might not be as sealed off as I believed. As he wrapped up, he mentioned follow-up dates and lab work, the usual formalities, but even then his gaze didn't quite match the formality of his tone. It lingered, just for a fraction too long, in a way that made the air between us feel narrower. When I stepped out into the corridor, the noise of the clinic returned, the muted shuffle of feet, the distant ring of a phone, but it felt oddly far away. My mind was still in that small examination room, replaying each pause, each moment where his focus had fixed on me as though searching for a detail I hadn't yet offered. That night, I tried to push it aside. I told myself it was nothing, a skilled doctor doing his job well, nothing more. But the memory didn't fade. Instead, it sharpened, like a photograph developing in the dark. I found myself recalling not his exact words, but the weight they carried, the measured calm of them. I didn't know it yet, but something had begun in that room. And once it began, it would be impossible to keep it contained. By the second visit, the novelty of a new clinic should have worn off. It didn't. I told myself it was the way Daniel organized information, how he stitched symptoms to habits and then to outcomes like someone mapping a coastline. But that wasn't why my answers felt longer, why I arrived early and sat with a steadiness I didn't feel. The truth was simpler and harder. He made conversation feel like a door left ajar. You told yourself you were only passing by, then realized you'd already stepped through. He began with routine questions and ended somewhere else without announcing the detour. Sleep became an opening to ask what I read before bed. Exercise turned into a question about the music that could pull me out of a fog. I mentioned a novel I'd been carrying around for months and never finishing. He didn't praise or dismiss it. He suggested one that might land better, a book that moved like a long breath. I said I'd try it, meaning it in the casual way patients agree to try vitamins. That night, I found the book online and read a third of it without noticing the time. On the third visit, he asked about the headaches that crept up late in the day, and I admitted they came in quiet rooms when my thoughts had too much space. I didn't plan to say that, but it slipped free before I could filter it. He listened and said there were clinical explanations, then added something less clinical. Some silences weren't restful, they echoed. I didn't nod or thank him for the poetry of it. I just knew he was right. We moved through the checklist with the inevitable fluency of people who'd met before. Then, in that margin at the end, where most appointments loosen into instructions and exit times, Daniel asked what I'd thought of the novel. I told him the author left the hardest truths off the page and trusted the reader to find them. He said there was a risk and that most writers blinked first. He asked which page I'd folded back to revisit. I told him. He didn't reach for the book on a shelf or pretend to know the line. He took the answer as proof I'd done the reading and asked what had changed. Somewhere around the fourth visit, music entered the conversation. He wanted to know if I had a song I avoided because it belonged to someone no longer here. I did, and I didn't say the title aloud. He understood anyway and said avoidance was sometimes care, a way of not reopening a door that didn't lead anywhere. He added, almost in passing, that grief trained the body to recognize ambushes. I carried that line out of the building like a prescription. None of this was romance. There were no prolonged glances I could photograph, no staged exchanges. It was something subtler, made of pauses that stretched a breath longer than etiquette allowed. He asked about mornings, and I told him I woke early but waited before I moved, as if I needed to negotiate with the day. He said some people called that resistance, and some called it wisdom. I said nothing. It felt like a conversation happening beneath the conversation, and I wanted to see where it might go if I pretended we were still only talking about blood work. He didn't fill silences with filler. When I stopped speaking, he gave the moment a chance to settle instead of rescuing it. That restraint did something I hadn't expected. It steadied my thoughts. I started to trust the space between us, to believe I could say a little more and it wouldn't be used against me. He never promised discretion. He didn't need to. The way he held the room was promise enough. Between visits, the world carried on with its usual clatter. I worked, replied to messages, ignored invitations that would have required cheerful small talk. But the appointments drew a thin line through the weeks, steady as a metronome. I began to keep a running list of things I might mention if there was time, short notes about a song I played on repeat and then avoided for 3 days, a line from the book that sat like a stone in the palm. I never brought the list into the clinic. I didn't need to. The moments opened by themselves. We talked about childhood once, but not in the sprawling way that turns into a biography. He asked where I learned to wait before I spoke, and I said probably in kitchens, listening to adults argue without raising their voices. He said quiet could be a blade too. I said I knew. He didn't ask for details. He didn't have to. He told me his story indirectly about endurance. Not his story, not in his words, but in the shape of a memory he made general. When you grow up learning that attention is earned by fixing things, you start looking for broken pieces everywhere. It sounded like an explanation for why some people became doctors and why others stayed longer in relationships that were already ending. I didn't ask which one he was. He shifted the focus back to my headaches and wrote down a small adjustment in my routine that looked ordinary and felt like an invitation to breathe. I realized the line existed during the 5th visit, not because anyone said so and not because of any obvious gesture. It was the air itself, how both of us knew when a sentence could turn into something riskier if we followed it one step further. He suggested a test. I agreed. He asked if anyone at home could keep an eye on me after, and I said no, but I'd be fine. He reminded me that being fine wasn't a metric. I laughed too quickly and told him I'd ask a neighbor to check in. That was a lie. He didn't call me on it. He only noted that some people got used to going it alone and didn't notice when their vocabulary shrank to that one word. It wasn't all seriousness. He had the kind of dry humor that doesn't reach for an audience. When I used an old expression to describe a lingering ache, he said the body collects idioms and isn't eager to give them back. When I told him I was trying to sleep without numbing myself with screens, he said the world would forgive me for logging off. It tends to forget us in minutes anyway. It should have sounded bleak. It didn't. It sounded like permission. The 6th visit was when the pauses grew heavy. Nothing dramatic had happened. The test results were acceptable. My numbers were not exemplary, not alarming, just ordinary. But the conversation slipped again into the corridor next to the clinical one. He asked if the book had held up. I said yes. He asked if the music still ambushed me. I said sometimes. He asked if I still waited by the window in the morning. I said less often. The questions were small stones laid in a row, easy to step across. Halfway over, I noticed a drop beside them. He said there are rules for good reasons, and he meant professional rules, boundaries drawn not to punish anyone, but to keep outcomes from distorting. I nodded. He said those rules protect 2 people at once. I nodded again, because I knew where the thought went if you let it. He left the sentence unfinished. I left my agreement unspoken. We returned to blood pressure and diet tweaks, as if surrendering to a current neither of us wanted to test. After that appointment, I tried to reset. I told myself to be pragmatic. I reminded myself that grief had a way of lighting false beacons in the dark, tricking you into chasing whatever felt warm. I repeated all the advice I would have given a friend. It made sense until I woke before dawn and caught myself listening for something I had no right to expect, the measured tone of a voice that made ordinary questions feel like a lifeline. A week later, I arrived for a short follow-up. The clinic was busier than usual, and schedules had slipped. He stepped into the room with the briskness of someone recapturing lost time, But even then he paused after the greeting, as if waiting to see which version of me had shown up. He moved through updates, made a small joke about a number trying to improve and pretending not to, then asked, almost in passing, whether I'd started anything new. I said I'd begun scribbling thoughts in a notebook, not a diary. Nothing that ambitious, just sentences I wanted to keep. He said that sounded like a pulse returning. It was the kind of line that could have turned into something else if spoken by someone with different intentions. From him, it sounded like medicine. It would have been safer to leave then, to hold on to the structure we'd built and not test how much weight it could carry. Instead, I mentioned an old memory that had surfaced while reading, a summer day that ended in an argument I could still feel years later, not because of words anyone used, but because of the silence that followed. He didn't drag the story into detail. He only said that certain silences didn't pass, they said. I asked what you did with a silence that had hardened over time. He said sometimes you learn to plan around it. He wasn't trying to be profound. He was, and I felt the shift again, the one that made me unsteady. People talk about chemistry as if it announces itself with fireworks. I have learned it can also arrive in quiet ways, a calibration of tempo and tone, an ease that becomes dangerous precisely because it feels so rational. He kept his distance without making the space feel cold. I stayed on my side of the line without pretending the line didn't exist. Neither of us named it. Naming would have given it shape, and shape would have demanded action. Outside the clinic, life pressed in with its practical demands. Groceries, bills, a leaky faucet that insisted on being noticed. I try to let those tasks anchor me. Most days they did. On others, I found myself replaying a sentence he'd left unfinished, filling it in with endings I didn't allow during daylight. This wasn't about fantasy. It was the ache of an almost, a conversation that could change direction if one of us allowed it an inch more gravity. The seventh visit put weight on the structure. He looked tired that day in a way only careful listeners look, worn not by effort, but by carrying too many stories at once. He didn't volunteer the reason. He never did. I asked about my own markers and got practical answers. Then he said, not quite casually, that he tried the author I recommended the previous week. I hadn't recommended anyone. I must have mentioned a name without noticing. He said the prose was spare in a way that left room for the reader to breathe. I didn't say what I was thinking, that I felt seen by the book the way I felt seen in this room. We spoke about how mornings had changed since the first visit. I told him I'd started walking before breakfast, not far, just enough to feel the day turn from possibility into fact. He said routine is a kindness disguised as duty. He was good at those small reversals that made ordinary acts feel like choices. He asked if I still avoided the song. I told him not always. He said that sounded like healing, then added, with the precision of someone correcting his own optimism, that it might also be habit loosening its grip. I appreciated the correction more than the comfort. It meant he was still watching for edges. The pause that followed felt different. Not heavier, exactly, but decisively shaped. It was the kind of pause that carries a question neither person wants to ask first. He filled it with something simple, a summary of next steps, a reminder to call if anything fell off, an offer to adjust the plan if my days made it difficult to follow. It was standard, responsible, easy to accept without thinking. I accepted anyway, then stayed seated a second longer than I needed to. He didn't hurry me. Eventually I stood, thanked him, and left. I made it to the corridor before realizing I'd almost said something I couldn't take back. Not a confession, not a plea, just a small acknowledgement that would have unlocked a larger one. It startled me how close I'd come. I walked slower than usual to the exit, as if distance might undo nearness. What began to change after that wasn't the content of our conversations, but the way I anticipated them. I caught myself planning what not to say. I practiced answers that would keep us on the safe side of the map. I also kept failing to use them. The room had its own climate. It made careful language feel unnecessary, even unkind. He didn't exploit that. He never pushed. He only left enough space that I could push myself. Rumors float through any place where people wait for outcomes. I started to notice the way certain heads turned when I checked in, the speculative glance at appointment times, the innocuous question about whether I preferred mornings or afternoons. None of it meant anything by itself. Together, it sounded like a whisper learning a sentence. I told myself I was imagining it. I'd spent years staying invisible, and invisibility makes you see threats where there are none. Still, I felt the tug of caution. Lines aren't only drawn by people inside a room. Sometimes the hall draws them for you. During the 8th visit, he asked if the notebook was still collecting sentences. I said yes, though most entries were nothing more than weather reports from inside my head. He said those counted. He said noticing was a form of repair. Then he surprised me by admitting, indirectly, that noticing came with a cost. Once you learned it, you couldn't stop, and some days that meant carrying more than you wanted. He didn't say it was his cost. He didn't have to. I recognized the shape of the burden. We were careful that day, careful in a way that felt like two people holding the same fragile object and pretending not to see each other's hands. The plan was simple. Continue what worked, tweak what didn't, call if something unexpected surfaced. He added a final line I hadn't heard from him before, that boundaries weren't suspicions. They were scaffolding. He said good structures let people climb higher without falling. I tried to imagine what counted as higher and whether the height was worth the view. After I left, I didn't go home right away. I walked for a long time, turning the sentence over until it lost its shine and became wood under the palm. Ordinary, supportive, necessary. I told myself that was the end of it. Two adults choosing to be sensible. Then the weeks stretched out, and the ordinary shape of days felt thin again, as if some part of me had grown used to the steadiness of that room and wanted a substitute. There isn't one. That was the problem. The 9th visit arrived after a delay. His schedule, not mine. The receptionist's tone was neutral, but I heard something underneath it when she offered the new time. The waiting room was noisy. A child laughed too loudly at a game on a phone. Someone argued gently about a bill. I tried to build a wall of indifference around myself, and failed. When Daniel entered, he didn't apologize for the delay. He never patted the edges with more words than were required. He checked the latest measures, asked about the walks, asked if I was still reading, asked if I'd added any new music. I had. He said nothing more than that he hoped it helped. Perhaps the restraint was deliberate. Perhaps he felt the pressure too. The pause came, as always did, and held. I felt the question between us like a low hum. Were we going to name what we were doing, building a structure strong enough to hold two different kinds of conversation? Or were we going to pretend it was still only one? He chose, as always, the side of safety. He summarized the plan. He reminded me of the number to call if anything shifted. He stood in a way that said the appointment was over without pushing me toward the door. I left with the ordinary cadence of a man headed back to a life he had under control. On the sidewalk, with a clinic behind me and a bus sighing at the curb, I realized something I didn't want to admit. The line wasn't simply between doctor and patient. It ran through me, splitting caution from desire, steadiness from hunger, survival from something that looked suspiciously like hope. And lines like that don't vanish because you pretend not to see them. They wait. They test your footing. They demand a decision. I wasn't ready to make one. So I did what I always did when choice felt like a cliff. I postponed it. I told myself the next visit would be simpler. I told myself I'd keep to practical matters, answer briefly, ignore whatever lived under the surface. Then I remembered the look from the first day, the one that had made the room feel smaller and safer at the same time, and I knew I was lying to myself again. The line remained where it had been from the start. Invisible, palpable, threaded through each pause. We were standing on either side of it, aware, steady, unwilling to pretend it didn't matter. And yet the weeks stretched a fraction tighter, as if time itself had begun to ask what we planned to do with the tension we'd built. I carried that question home and let it sit on the table with the unopened mail. It didn't go away. It never does. That is what a line is for. It keeps you honest. It keeps you careful. It keeps you awake. The first sign didn't arrive like a revelation. It came as an aside, one of those offhand remarks people make when they believe they're being harmless. I was paying at the pharmacy desk after a routine refill when the clerk, who had recognized my name from the clinic system, mentioned that Dr. Reed was good but careful. The kind of careful that sounded earned rather than innate. She said it with a softness that made me wonder what exactly had taught him to move like that. Later, in a waiting room that smelled faintly of disinfectant and impatience, two people traded stories about providers. The exchange slid past me until one of them brought up a doctor, no name given, who had once been the subject of whispers for spending too much time with a patient after hours. The second person responded as if it were old news, something that had been picked clean by gossip and left to dry. They moved on to insurance codes, and I tried to do the same. I failed. A line had been drawn in my mind, connecting what I'd heard to the restraint I'd been noticing for weeks. I told myself rumors are lazy explanations. People prefer tidy narratives, especially when they feel shut out. But the thread tugged. It tugged when a nurse praised Daniel's thoroughness in a tone that held a trace of defense. It tugged when a receptionist's smile flattened for half a second after she said his schedule was full. It tugged when a neighbor, who rarely paid attention to anything outside his own routine, remarked that the clinic had tightened up its policies this season. He didn't know why. He didn't need to. The hint was enough. I did not interrogate anyone. I didn't ask pointed questions or play detective in hallways. I only listened to the shape of comments, to the air that changed when his name came up. The picture formed slowly. Months before I arrived at the clinic, Daniel had been seen meeting a former patient for coffee. The patient had been in a rough stretch. New job, failing parent, the slow collapse of a relationship. They had, according to the aggregate of retellings, become friends in that gray space where care doesn't quite end at discharge. Friendship is a word people use when they want to be kind and when they don't have proof of anything else. The clinic administration, I gathered, had asked questions. Questions had turned into a review. The review had ended without formal punishment, but the warning had been clear enough to act as one. None of this had the solidity of official record. It was knowledge that moved by breath and text message and sigh. Yet it matched what I was seeing up close. A professional who maintained distance without making distance feel like cold. A man who left pauses in our conversations not just because he was patient, but because he knew precisely how far speech can travel before it crosses a border. Once I understood the rumor's shape, other details sharpened. He never suggested informal follow-ups. He never offered the kind of kindly shortcut professionals sometimes do when they trust a patient. If he recommended a book, he did so as an example, not alone. If he commented on a thought, he kept the door firmly hinged inside the appointment. He didn't model temptation. He modeled restraint. What felt like cautious grace now looked like policy carried in the bones. I didn't feel betrayed by the story. If anything, I felt implicated, like someone who had been walking toward a sign and pretending not to read it. The line we'd been circling wasn't hypothetical. It had a history. It had almost cost him. That recognition changed my posture. In the next visit, I held my answers closer to the safe edge. I trimmed digressions. When a memory rose, I pressed it back down and stuck to numbers and sleep and the page count of a book we'd both been reading. He did not reward or punish the change. He simply accepted it, and for a moment the room felt simpler, almost easy. Then the ease turned into something thinner, a quiet that didn't steady me but left me slightly adrift. I recognized the difference. It was the silence of omission. I walked out of that appointment certain of two things. He had reasons for his caution, and if I cared about him at all, which was becoming impossible to deny, needed to help protect those reasons, even if protection meant stepping back from the one place where I'd felt most awake in months. But stepping back isn't a single act. It's a practice you have to repeat, especially when the mind keeps returning to the scene of its own revival. I tried a set of private rules. Don't linger after the plan has been summarized. Don't offer personal anecdotes unless they serve a clinical purpose. Don't read new meaning into ordinary courtesy. Don't expect anything beyond what the appointment allows. The rules worked until they didn't. They failed in small ways first. A sentence I wanted to share because it had helped me through a long night, a song I finally let play without flinching. I kept those to myself, and then resented the discipline, as if I were withholding air. The rumors found me again, not as scandal, but as a cautionary tale repeated by someone who claimed to be on Daniel's side. At a community health talk, a retired nurse told a circle of listeners that good clinicians forget they are habitats for other people's hopes. She said boundaries weren't fences around power. They were shelters built for mutual survival. She never said his name. She didn't have to. The phrasing was his. I knew his voice in the echo of someone else's. I wondered about the former patient. Not the identity, not the specifics. I wondered about the moment the line blurred. Had it started with extra minutes offered at the end of an appointment? A book recommended and then discussed over tea? A holiday text that asked, too gently, how the week was going? If I could imagine those moments, it was only because I could see the same openings in our own map. The difference was that we had both learned the cost of following them. He from experience, I from intuition and a delayed education in self-preservation. There was a day when I considered changing providers. On paper, it made sense. A clean break would offer protection from speculation and temptation both. I could return to the safer monotony of clinical exchanges that did not unsettle anything I wanted to keep settled. I even drafted the message in my head, a polite note citing logistics. I never sent it. The thought of starting over, of returning to a version of care that treated me as a data set, felt like a retreat from my own life. The point of seeing him, I realized, had not been a slow slide toward romance. It had been the recovery of an honest pulse. At the next appointment, I told myself to be nothing but ordinary. He asked about headaches. I gave him times and durations. He asked about sleep. I listed hours and interruptions. He asked about the walks. I mentioned distance and weather. Then he asked whether the notebook still collected sentences. I could have offered a number, a page count, a stereometric. Instead, I said the entries were getting shorter and truer, like a muscle learning to work again. I didn't look up after saying it. I didn't need to. I could feel the room recalibrate. He noted something on the chart and said, in that even way of his, that clarity often arrived in fragments. He did not push the moment further. Neither did I. If the past explains a person's caution, it can also become its own trap. You start moving not toward what you want, but away from what you fear. I watched for signs of that in him and in myself. He was measured, but never rigid. I was disciplined, but increasingly restless. Restlessness can be disguised as principle. I kept reminding myself that empathy wasn't a license. It was a duty. Whispers have a life cycle. They flare, they fade, they leave a residue. Over the next few weeks, the chatter around the clinic shifted to other topics. An insurance change, a staff departure, a A new policy about telemedicine. The residue remained. I noticed how colleagues greeted him. Friendly, professional, a touch formal. No one excluded him. No one leaned on him, either. It was the social version of a neutral tone. He didn't bend toward or away from it. He simply did the work. One afternoon, after a blood draw and a reminder about hydration, I sat in the car longer than necessary before starting the engine. I tried to name what I was feeling without dressing it up. It wasn't jealousy of anyone in his past. It wasn't anger at the rumor. It was something closer to recognition. We were navigating with a map that marked all the hazards, but none of the destinations. If we were lucky, the map would bring us to a place where the line remained intact and the conversation kept its shape. If we were unlucky, the map would lead to the very outcome caution was designed to prevent. Not because of scandal, but because of drift, the slow cooling that follows sustained self-denial. I thought about the first appointment and the shock of being seen. I thought about the later ones and the weight of not saying too much. I thought about the stories people told to make sense of other people's lives. Then I considered the only story I had the right to author, my own. It required deciding how to hold both truths at once. That Daniel had a past that pressed on him, and that I had a present that needed care. Care, in this case, meant remaining while refusing to inch the line. So I made a different set of rules. They were quieter than the first and less punitive. Share what helps the work. Keep what belongs to longing. Respect the appointment's walls. Refuse to turn them into a cage. Notice the pauses. Do not harvest them for meaning they cannot safely carry. Accept that the past is a weight. Do not ask him to set it down for you. At the next visit, I carried those rules like stones in a pocket. The room felt as it always did, grounded by purpose. He reviewed results, adjusted a plan, offered a small suggestion that sounded ordinary and landed like relief. When the pause came, I kept it simple. I said the walks were easier. I said the mornings felt less like negotiations. He nodded, waiting for the rest. There wasn't more. Not because I was afraid, but because I was learning to separate hunger from need. If he sensed the shift, he didn't label it. He closed the chart, reminded me of the next date, and added a sentence I hadn't heard from him before, one that belonged to neither warning nor invitation. He said continuity matters. It was a plain truth, almost administrative, and yet it settled in my chest as something steadier, a promise to keep the structure intact, even under pressure. The past hadn't released him. It likely never would. But it had taught him to hold the line without hardening into it. I understood that now. Understanding didn't remove the ache. It made the ache honest. And honesty, I was discovering, was its own kind of care. The volume rose without anyone raising a voice. It started in the places where people wait. Near printers, beside elevators, at the corner where the hallway narrows and forces two bodies to pass closer than they want. A question would be floated with a light tone. Had anyone noticed how often I was on the schedule? Then withdrawn before an answer could implicate the asker. Laughter, clipped short, followed like punctuation. No one said Daniel's name when I was in earshot. They didn't need to. The shape of the silence did it for them. He adjusted by subtracting himself. He arrived on time, left on time, and threaded his day through the gaps other people avoided. If a staff meeting turned social, he stepped back. If a colleague lingered with a story about weekend plans, he listened, nodded, and cut it short with courtesy. The change was noticeable because he had never been showy about collegiality to begin with. Now, the reserve felt engineered, the posture of someone refusing to provide more material. It worked in the narrow sense. No fresh anecdotes to feed the room, but it sharpened the appetite of speculation. Policies began arriving by email with subject lines that suggested routine housekeeping. Reminders about scope of practice, guidelines for communication after hours, notes on documentation. The memos were neutral on the surface and pointed underneath. I read them as a patient only because a nurse, trying to smooth over an awkward reschedule, mentioned that the clinic was standardizing everything. She said it like a compliment to order. Her eyes said it like a warning about deviation. In the waiting room, I felt the shift. A man paging through forms looked up once, then twice, then fixed on the space behind me, as if I blocked a view he needed. A woman at the desk asked whether I preferred mornings. When I said yes, she suggested afternoons with the kind of brightness reserved for instructions disguised as options. Another day, a tech remarked that my follow-ups had a nice cadence. She used that word, cadence, and then colored it with a pause that let others hear frequency. The observation would have been harmless if it hadn't been made within earshot of someone eager to complete a pattern. Outside the clinic, judgment took on a different shape. A friend from years back suggested, in a voice meant to sound caring, that I might consider seeking care elsewhere just to keep things clean. He didn't define clean. He didn't have to. Another acquaintance joked about my newfound commitment to preventative medicine. When I didn't laugh, he revised the joke into advice. People were watching. People always watched. Best not to give them something to aim at. He didn't know he had already aimed. Daniel didn't feed the narrative. He stopped referencing books we had both read. He kept questions closer to health and let them end where they belonged. When our eyes met at the beginning of an appointment, there was a moment that acknowledged the noise outside and refused to carry it in. He worked as he always had, precise, attentive, spare, with one addition: no extra seconds. Not a single beat that could be stretched into a story. The administration's concern found its way into practice by indirection. My appointments were nudged to different days, then to different rooms. Once, I was moved after I'd already checked in, with an apology that was both sincere and rehearsed. The new room had the same equipment, the same clock, the same 2 chairs. The difference was the corridor outside, which funneled foot traffic past the door like a parade. If anyone needed proof they weren't hiding anything, this was it. Full visibility, constant passing witnesses, an open acknowledgement that oversight had become atmosphere. The gossip didn't fade with exposure. It adapted. I overheard 2 volunteers compare calendars, then note how some names clustered. Mine was offered as an example, but not spoken fully, just the first syllable, stretched into recognition, then withdrawn midair as if the rest would be impolite. They agreed it was probably nothing, but said probably as a way to keep the option of something. Walking home afterward, I measured the cost of staying. It wasn't danger, not in the dramatic sense. It was abrasion. Each appointment picked up a thin layer of grit, and carefulness rubbed against it until both of us left a little scuffed. I had told myself in the beginning that the line would protect us. Now I understood the line could be used as evidence that there was something to protect. One afternoon, I arrived early and waited where the light hit the floor in a bar that moved across the tiles and then disappeared. I didn't read. I didn't check my phone. I tried to hold still and see whether stillness could blunt the sharpness of rumor. It didn't. A nurse called my name firmly, as if clarity could be performed. Daniel greeted me with the same measured steadiness as always. He reviewed data, asked about sleep, asked whether the walks still helped. They did. I said so. He nodded and noted a small adjustment without looking from my eyes. It was an intentional omission. I understood why and hated that I understood. The pause, our old pivot, arrived and shortened itself. I left before it could become a question. In the hallway, 2 staff members fell silent as I passed. One of them smiled. The other arranged papers with more attention than papers need. Their performance was gentle and undeniable. I stepped into the day, carrying the weight of what goes unsaid. The talk eventually reached places that could act. A supervisor pulled Daniel into an office. The door closed. Minutes later, he returned with a face that didn't announce anything, which is how you know something was said. After that, our appointments were assigned to chaperoned rhythm. More checklists, clearer endpoints, exit cues that clicked like cleanly latched doors. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. The room had been deputized. Friends pressed again. Transfer care, they said, framing it as mercy for both of us. I considered it as strategy rather than retreat. It would put distance between my name and their guessing games. It would give him proof of compliance. But the thought of stepping back into unanchored exchanges, clinical without depth, felt like cutting the cord that had hauled me out of a long, dark stretch. Continuity had become more than convenience. It was the way my life had begun to move again. At the next visit, I arrived at the precise time on the reminder message. Daniel moved through the assessment with unbroken pace. Near the end, he asked, strictly as a professional courtesy, the tone made clear, whether I had any concerns about the care plan. I said I had one, that the plan should survive the noise around it. He accepted the comment without elevation, said the plan would hold if we kept to it, and ended the appointment at the mark where endings belong. No flair, no softness. A demonstration. In that tight frame, our eyes met once. The look said what policy allowed, that we recognized the pressure, that we would not make it someone else's job to manage it for us, that we would not fold. It wasn't romance. It was resolve. The whispers continued, as whispers do, weather for people who need weather. The clinic kept its new tempo. I kept showing up, on time, prepared, practical. In the grocery line one evening, a woman from the waiting room stood behind me and asked whether I thought the clinic had changed lately. I said places change when they try to protect themselves. She agreed without asking what from. Judgment never announces that it is finished. It just finds a new subject. Weeks later, the talk shifted to a billing issue on another floor. The volume around us dropped, not because we had won anything, but because boredom had done its work. A space opened, small and usable. We used it the only way we could, by doing nothing that could be mistaken for everything. The line held. The work continued. The looks remained brief, exact, true in a way that words could not safely be. Daniel left before anyone could hand him a decision in writing. There was no announcement, just a gap in the schedule where his name used to be. The clinic carried on without explanation, filling his patients into other calendars. I learned of it not from him, but from a receptionist reading from a prepared line about a change in staffing. Her voice was even, the kind that refused questions. For days, I half expected a message, something brief to acknowledge the end of that narrow space we had shared. None came. The absence confirmed what I already understood. Departure had been his shield. Leaving on his own terms meant no public verdict, no final stamp of guilt or innocence. It also meant no private farewells that could be misread. The city is small when you're not looking for someone. A week after the news, I passed a cafe I rarely visited and saw him through the glass. No coat, no ID badge, no clipboard, just another man in line with his hand around a paper cup. He had traded the compressed pace of the clinic for a looser rhythm, one that didn't carry the weight of other people's bodies and secrets. I stopped outside, telling myself I would keep walking. He turned before I could decide. Our eyes caught, not in surprise, but in recognition that had been waiting. The air between us didn't feel like the clinic anymore. No chart, no timer, no line to defend. There was no polite deflection, no lowering of the gaze to make the moment smaller. I stepped inside, not quickly, not as if closing a gap before it could vanish. He stayed where he was, letting the space shrink naturally. Words would have been easy, but neither of us needed to narrate this. In that held look, we acknowledged the noise we'd walked through, the restraint we'd practiced, the damage avoided, and the pieces lost along the way. When the line moved, he ordered without turning away. I took my place behind him, close enough to feel the shift in how we stood, no longer bound by the roles that had defined every previous exchange. Whatever came next wouldn't be dictated by schedules or supervision. He picked up his drink and paused, as if giving me the choice to follow or to let this be the ending. I matched his pace when he walked toward the door. Outside, the air was sharp and the street noise made privacy effortless. We didn't make plans. We didn't need to. The look had already agreed on one thing. This time, neither of us would turn away first. The choice had been made in different ways for each of us. Him by leaving, me by staying long enough to see the space open. The consequence was simple and complicated at once. We were free to meet as ourselves, without a line to guard. Whatever boundaries remained now were ours to draw.